Um,
Report.
if you weren't here last week, that's okay. We basically just covered another 600 years last week. So, but that puts us solidly towards the middle end of the 1400s. That's kind of where we kind of left off. And I'll just back up a little bit and say, one of the things we mentioned last week was this curious incident that Martin Luther later called the Babylonian captivity. What happened is there was a pope elected in Rome, and that person was judged ineffectual. Well, actually, that person decided to move the papacy to Avignon in France. So the Bishop of Rome built like a palace in Avignon. Well, not everybody was real happy with that, so they elected another pope to be the pope in Rome. So there were two popes, but which one was the pope? So then a third one was elected. So there were three popes at the same time. I'm not making this up. Like, this is the thing, right? So this happened from like the 1200s to the 1300s. Which one's the real? Will the real pope please stand up? And is Rome in Rome, or is it in Avignon? Like, there was some real confusion. So you're kind of starting to hear between the Crusades and the persecution of the Cathars and other things like, who's the real pope? How can there be three? Because part of the papacy rests on this idea of apostolic succession, and there's an unbroken chain back to the Lord. But now you've got three of them, and then you start to compile other things, like I mentioned last week: illiterate clergy, simony, that is buying offices, and then there starts to be this other real tension, because not only can the clergy not understand Latin, and the people can't understand Latin, but people apparently really wanted to understand their church. I think I mentioned to you that the Rosary came back from encounter in the Crusades. They were Islamic prayer beads, and people in the pew wanted them. And the demand was so high that the papacy essentially acquiesced, but put a cross on them. So that was a grassroots up thing. That wasn't the Pope brought that over. That was people came back and wanted it. And so, like, people wanted real piety. Stained glass windows come out right in the 1100s, 1200s, and people are actually able to like learn about stories from the Bible that they can't read, that is read to them in Latin, but the priest may not even be able to understand what he's reading because he can't read, and the people in the pew can't understand the story. So it turns out one of the most popular books, and you can buy this, it's really thick. I don't recommend it. I think it's super boring, to be honest. It's called The Golden Legend, and it's stories about the saints. And in general, like, they kill people who are disrespectful to them, and they do these miracles. And this was very popular literature in the Middle Ages because it was written not in Latin.
It wasn't in Latin?
Not in Latin. No, it was, or if it was officially written in Latin, fine. It became common. When I say mythology, I don't mean it in the fairy tale. It became like, these became important stories, and you were allowed to tell them in your native language, whereas the Bible, you couldn't. So the Bible was actually rather inaccessible, and the saints were accessible because you could hear about them in Gallic, in German, in Celtic, but you could only hear the Bible in Latin.
So that's the reason all the convents and the nuns, they all had saints' names. And,
well, that's an old tradition too, that you have two names. So that's why we still say you're christened. You have your like ethnic name, but then you get your Christian name. By the way, if you're Jewish, we mentioned this too. Many Jews in this country have their given name, and then they have their Jewish name when they have a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah sometimes before. And it still happens sometimes in countries like Greece that you have a saint's name, but you also have your other name. And so that still happens today. But to your point, that's part of the legacy going on. Well, I hope you're hearing what I want to say is there starts to become tension, and people start to say, look, if we can have like saints and we can have pictures of the stories, why can't we have the stories? And some of the early people who do this, it doesn't end well for them. Like William Tyndale, who translates the Bible into English. He does that in Amsterdam. It's illegal. They end up, well, looking for him to kill him, and they succeed. But Tyndale's translation of the Bible, arguably the most influential one like ever. It was illegal. It was before King James, but his turns of phrase like, yea, that I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, that's William Tyndale. And it was so popular. I mean, again, the church really tried to suppress this because it was a challenge to imperial authority under one language. But they were not successful in suppressing it. So people were reading these illegal pamphlets, not because they wanted to be lawbreakers, but because they wanted to read the Bible.
When you say under one language, was it Latin?
Latin, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And until 1968, it was still Latin, to be really
No,
clear.
I went to mass
In Latin.
And I could say it. Well, because I spoke Spanish, there was
Some carryovers.
There was a lot of carryover.
Yeah.
What was the Tyndale translation? What language was that?
In English. Yeah. And there were a couple people as well, like Jan Hus, who was in Prague, which at the time, that was the capital of the Bohemian Empire and was influential. John Wycliffe in England as well, was trying to translate Latin into the common tongue. First person who seems to really have succeeded. I mean, they did it and they got away with it. So these other guys did not get away with it. Jan Hus was burned at the stake for doing this. First one who got away with it was Martin Luther. He wasn't the first to do it. He was the first who got away with it.
What were they writing the Bible on?
Yeah, okay, so still, like, paper is relatively new. Paper is relatively new. Curiously enough, there's a strong correlation between the development of paper and the acquisition of underwear. I had a friend in Georgia who was really into this, but apparently, I mean, Europeans didn't wear underwear for a long time, and then they like figured out how to make underwear, which had to do with fibers, and they figured out then that you could use those fibers to make paper. So prior to that, right, everything's written on vellum, which is veal skin. Really expensive because an animal has to die that doesn't grow up to give you milk or meat, right? I mean, it's a very small thing. And I guess if you lived in Egypt, you could make it on a papyrus, but papyrus doesn't do well in a climate that has any humidity. I mean, papyrus does poorly in Houston, to be clear, because it's just smashed grass. So it mildews and molds. Right. So paper gets developed, and part of that has to do with the Renaissance, which really is kind of Islamic learning that preserved Roman learning and turned it up a couple of notches. And that starts to infiltrate through trade routes into the 1400s. So Europe is getting this figured out. Also, people like Marco Polo figure out that there's China and people have paper there. So we're getting extra world influences, and the world is much bigger than people thought, and that's being figured out through trade. We haven't quite, I mean, Columbus sails in 1492, right? We got that. And we realized, hey, maybe the world's not as flat as we thought it was. So all of the world's getting bigger. And as I mentioned during the Crusades, sure, like you're over there and you're like killing the infidel, but you're also realizing they have a much higher standard of living than you have, right? And so how do it'd be nice if we had plumbing. That would be nice. It'd be nice if we had subterranean sewers like the infidel has, right? I mean, that's essentially what's going on, right? So there is a hunger for learning, and this is going to happen with Luther. And reminder, I don't want to like give you the whole biography, but Luther was just really tightly wound. He had no intention of being a reformer. He wanted to be a lawyer. His dad sent him to law school, and then he got scared in a storm and said, God, if you don't kill me, I'll be a priest. And he survived the storm. And so he became a priest. And sure enough, we just celebrated this. Reformation Day is October 31st. This year was the 507th anniversary of Luther putting his theses on the Wittenberg bulletin board. This was a common practice. Luther wasn't like brand new and nailing something to the doors. That's where you put things. So it was encouraged that when you had a community announcement, you did it. So Luther's the one who does that. And part of the thing that really pushed him over the edge was that the Pope was trying to rebuild Rome and wanted to build the biggest, best church in the world, because it was in Constantinople. It was. The Hagia Sophia was the biggest freestanding dome in the world for 1,000 years. St. Peter's becomes bigger, and it takes a lot of money to pay for that. And the papacy didn't have money. So how do you raise money? They came up with this great idea, which is called indulgences. And maybe you've heard of it. And indulgence rests on this idea that there are good people in the world. We call them saints, like St. James and St. Christopher and St. George. And those people had more credits than debits. Like they did more good than bad. And so as a result, when you total that out, you get a positive. And the church is the broker of goodness. So the saints have like built up the account, which means when you do something wrong, when you do a debit, you need a credit. That's called penance. You have to make up for what you did wrong. You do a debit, you need to pay back, right? With interest, probably. So the idea is that, by the way, in order to get forgiveness, you have to have contrition and penance. This has always been the case. You have to be sorry for what you did, and you have to make it right. Well, the idea with the indulgence is there's so much rightness from the saints that we can like cover that. You still have to be sorry, but you won't have to do penance if you buy the indulgence. Well, so this became really lucrative, it turns out, and it was actually relatively modestly practiced in much of the Holy Roman Empire, but there was a used car salesman in Germany that Martin Luther ran up against, who said things like, every time a penny in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. I mean, this was like very clever. And so Martin Luther started thinking like, wow, like, by the way, Martin Luther bought an indulgence himself when he visited Rome on pilgrimage earlier, but it was this aggressive sales tactic. And Luther started to think like, wait a second, like I've gone to school, I know how to read, and I don't find this in the scriptures. So he was privileged that he was able to read the scriptures, and he didn't find it. So his protest was not against indulgences, period. It was really against this particular salesman who was, in his opinion, defrauding people who were poor because they were concerned not only for themselves, but for their dead relatives. You could buy indulgences per this guy for like your great grandma. Now, when it started out, it was just for yourself, right? But now, like, people are worried that their beloved grandma is in purgatory, and if you buy the indulgence, then she won't have to be in purgatory anymore. We haven't talked about purgatory at all, have we? Purgatory is where you go to, when you do things wrong on earth, well, you do have a consequence for them. So the good news is you don't go to hell forever. You go to purgatory, where you pay for that thing, and then when it's paid for, then you either go to hell forever or you go to heaven. So purgatory is how God is perfectly just.
And you can buy your time out of purgatory, I mean, out of.
Per this particular salesman.
That.
Yeah, which again.
Catholic school.
Yeah.
So we were taught all of that stuff, and so we sold little stamps.
But see, and to be really clear, that was an innovation that seemed to be localized to Germany. If Luther had been in France, this may not have been his experience with indulgences, but it was his experience in Germany. And so he wrote these 95 Theses, and if you read them, they're pretty much all about indulgences. I mean, they're not like all the criticisms of the Catholic Church. They're the criticisms of this practice. And there's a really interesting thing. The Pope was feeling a little bit insecure at this time, and here's this university professor who honestly would just like to have a conversation about whether we should be doing this particular way of indulgences. So Luther was not a Lutheran. He was a Roman Catholic priest who didn't like one practice.
So the indulgences were monetary.
Yes.
Couldn't you pray your way out instead of?
Well, and this has always been an interesting thing. So yeah, prayers is a thing. That's because in penance, usually you'll hear this, say 5 Our Fathers and 4 Hail Marys, drink some holy water, and then like do this other thing, right? So, but sometimes the penance would be pray like 1,000 Our Fathers, and it had been happening for a while that you would pay monks to do it for you.
In modern times, when I was in Catholic school, when we went to confession, we were given prayers to do, like say,
Yes.
Our Fathers. But we never told to drink holy water or that.
It
whatever.
just depends who your local person was, right?
Well, this was in 1950.
But you thank God for that, right? And so there's also this.
This is of the divine providence.
Yeah, but the prayers thing is interesting, right? And so actually, before indulgences, you could pay a monk who's saying 1,000 Our Fathers a day anyway to say them for
For
you.
you.
And there became this thing that you could have people who would say masses for you or for your grandma. By the way, really clear in the Episcopal Church, can't have a mass unless there's 2 of us. So no priest can consecrate any Eucharist by themselves. And that's a result of this happening in the Roman Church. By the way, Roman priests can say the mass by themselves. To this day, can. Not normal, but can. Because the mass isn't exactly for you, it's the thing God needs. So it's like a different way of doing this, or that humanity needs, whether they're present in the room or not. Like mass needs to be said. So again,
I'm stuck here.
yeah,
Go ahead.
there are priests who will have a mass by themselves, and they may advertise. Like if I advertise we're having the Eucharist and no one showed up, I'm not doing it because I can't. But it is true in the Roman Church, you could have a daily mass and no one shows up, and the priest is still going to say the mass.
Well, what does he do with the consecrated? bread
Puts
and
it in
wine?
reserve or eats it,
Yeah,
same as we do.
yeah, that's what- They have a place where they can.
They have a tabernacle like we do. Yeah.
Okay.
When Luther put the 99 things up on the board, could the people read them?
No, because people couldn't read. So just the academics at the university, right? So Luther is this little professor in Wittenberg, right? And essentially who could read it? Some of his students and his colleagues. And who cared? To be honest, probably nobody, but this little regional episode, times being what they were, Pope feeling insecure because he was a Medici and probably bought the office, right? He simonied the papacy, decided that this was going to be an example. So Luther was summoned to the Diet of Worms. Maybe you know about this. He was assured safe passage, or he probably wouldn't have gone. And sure enough, there he faced Johannes Tetzel, like the Grand Inquisitor, and he said, how is it you're making this decision? And Luther said, well, I do it on Scripture alone. And Tetzel said, how curious, Martin, because we got Scripture through tradition. He wasn't wrong, by the way, like he wasn't wrong about that. So it's interesting to think about that argument, because in the Protestant faith, we're like, that's right, sola scriptura, without stopping to think like, oh, there was tradition and how the books got to be that we call Scripture. Anyway, the decision was Martin Luther's excommunicated. And his safe passage was also like relatively in jeopardy, like he could have been killed and burned at the stake immediately, except, you probably know this, there was a German prince who decided he would spirit Luther away. And Luther didn't know that was going to happen. Like, he got kidnapped and didn't know who kidnapped him. It was Frederick the Wise, who was a German prince. Was he convinced that Luther was right, or did he see an opportunity to seize Catholic lands and increase his princedom? Maybe both. Because by the time Luther got to Worms, it wasn't just indulgences. When you push somebody really, really hard, push them into a corner, which is what happened with Luther. Again, he wanted to be a Roman Catholic priest. He just wanted the church to change this one practice. Well, under pressure, he decided a lot of these practices weren't working. And hey, if there's really no hope, should the church own all this land? Because the church was the majority landholder in Europe. So Friedrich the Wise, and keep in mind, right, Luther was advocating scriptures in the common tongue. So Friedrich the Wise captures him, puts him in the Wartburg, which is by Eisenach, and there Luther spends about a year translating the Bible from Latin, and when he's able to get manuscripts, they weren't very old, from Greek and Hebrew into German. Which, by the way, if you're a native German speaker, you still speak Luther's German. The Luther Bible is the German language. It's 500 years old. Consider that English has changed quite a bit since King James. German hasn't.
Really?
Which is getting it into a little bit of trouble now. Yeah. But it's an old, it's, I mean,
Why is it getting into trouble now?
well, because the world is different.
Oh, yeah, okay.
You know, like we have a very different cultural context now. This is even true in Spanish. Like it's still like a somewhat novel idea to talk about God being above gender. So we talk about God neutrally. Like we don't say God has a big arm and he is strong. We say God has a big arm and God is strong. So that's neutral. In German and even Spanish, that's nonsense, right? Like it's Señor, right? It's like God is Señor. Well, that sounds really masculine. Is there a neutral word for God? Señor.
It's a no.
Right? But that's masculine by definition. It is. And German works like that too, because unlike English, there still are gender-based articles and articles are all gender-based arbitrarily, right? Like a key is masculine and a boat is feminine.
Was Simon Catholic or was he? Oh, no. Or was he a barbarian?
Was who? Sorry.
The person that spirited away.
Oh, Friedrich the Wise.
Oh, Friedrich the Wise. Yeah, he was Catholic because he had to be. It was the Holy Roman Emperor. So look, if you wanted to be a prince and the Holy Roman Emperor, you had to be Catholic. But he wasn't the only one who, frankly, was tired of the rule of the papacy, which was in Latin, not in German, and based in Roman, not in Germany, right? I mean, like we know what's best for our own people. And I don't want to say he's wrong. Obviously, there was personal advantage to this too. But what ends up happening, right, is Luther translates the Bible. He secretly gets married to a nun because he decides marriage is biblical. I mean, Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, which suggests Peter was married to somebody. That's how one gets a mother-in-law. So Martin Luther decided clergy marriage would just be fine. Thank you very much, right? And so this begins the Reformations, not just because there's an idea, but because now there's political power backing it. And it also starts this really awful religious war called the 30 Years' War. And the 30 Years' War is essentially a war in Europe between Roman Catholicism and the right to self-determination.
The right to
Self-determination. Who gets to decide whether I'm going to become Protestant, meaning Lutheran, or Roman Catholic? Of course, you kind of figure out at the end, at least in Germany with the Peace of Westphalia, that's the ones that signed, is that the prince decides the religion of his sphere of influence. That takes more than 30 years, and a lot of people die over that. And it goes back and forth. Like the Catholics are doing great until the Swedes come down. Gustavus Adolphus, who was probably like the Napoleon of his day in terms of his military brilliance and ability to move cannons, basically saves the Protestant cause. Because, whether you know, Swedes and Norwegians are Lutherans by and large, right? I mean, Lutheran Church very strong there. That goes back to this time. Yeah, and so Luther's German Bible makes it. I think I might have told you in his Bible, Revelation's not the last book, the book of James is, because he didn't care for it. But Luther wasn't a total reformer, and you probably know this. Luther, some other people took Luther and said, like, oh, look, Luther's giving us an opportunity, and we're peasants, and we deserve rights. And so there became like a peasants' war. And Luther was like, I hope you all die. I hope the nobility crush your spirits and your life, because you should know your place. Luther was also a radical anti-Semite, like a radical anti-Semite. And so he did a couple of things well, which is a good reminder, right? That like even people who do things well that we appreciate get stuff wrong. And Luther was that. So this is the beginning of the Reformation. Meanwhile, in Spain, the Inquisition's still going on. So look, there's no Reformation in Spain. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That's also when the Jews and the Moors were driven out of Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella. They were driven out both with military fight and also a secret police called the Inquisition, who would go and test whether or not, okay, you converted 3 generations ago, but we don't trust your Christian credentials. You might secretly be practicing your Jewry. This is part of why Ladino, which is a mix between Hebrew and Spanish, was almost a dead language. There's a resurgence to it now. Whereas Yiddish, right, Hebrew and German mix is doing okay because the Inquisition was very targeted and systematic. And because people who spoke Ladino had to either leave Spain, go, where are they going to go?
Where'd they go?
Yeah, not a lot of options. They could convert, they're called conversos, but conversos weren't really accepted because you're just doing it so we don't kill you. well, yeah, right. So that's part of the problem. And anytime a converso had money, it was like, oh, I know how to get your money. We'll just accuse you of doing something wrong. I'm not saying everybody did that, but look, when financial gain is on the table, it's really hard to be purely ethical.
I got lost on the languages. We have a very good Jewish friend who speaks Ladino.
Yeah. Again, minority, many more people speak Yiddish because that was a much bigger, wider territory. Yiddish was spoken from Germany all the way out into Russia. Ladino was in Spain, just in Spain, really. Some people made it to Morocco, but some made it to Morocco, really close to Spain, where they lived, what do you know, with Muslims who tolerated them, but they had to pay that tax.
I don't understand. Well, I'm trying to remember if I've listened to someone to speak Ladino.
Yeah.
Sari speaks that.
You'd understand some of it.
See, no, I understand a lot of it.
Yeah, because it's mostly Spanish, but with some rolled in. I mean, I understand a lot of Yiddish if I can translate the way it's pronounced into Hochdeutsch, which is the language I learned, which is Luther's German. We say it's Queen German or High German. It's Luther's German. If I can get a Yiddish word into Hochdeutsch, I probably know it.
You know, there's still people that speak Ladino.
No, I'm agreeing with you, and it's resurging. Yeah, that's growing now because people are saying we don't want to lose our language. This is too important for us just to drop. There's more people who speak Ladino now than 50 years ago.
Saudi and his family back in 1500 went to the Ottoman Empire because they were very tolerant of the Jewish people.
Yeah, and there's also been a very, very strong Jewish population in modern day Iran because the former Shahs, again, we're very happy to have really bright folks working for them who also paid them extra taxes. This is mostly a European problem, not a Muslim problem. Islam has not had trouble with Judaism until Zionism. Some people say, when I do that, I'm being anti-Semitic. I don't think I am. I think there's a difference between being Jewish and being Zionist. I believe that. But I'm not Jewish. So maybe I shouldn't say that. Anyway, that's Spain. Switzerland, you probably know, has this reformer named Ulrich Zwingli, who is kind of parallel with Martin Luther. similar trajectory, although Zwingli wants to do a little more reform than Luther does. In fact, they agreed on 99 points, but the 100th point they couldn't agree on was whether or not the Eucharist had the real presence of Jesus or was symbolic. And they couldn't agree, so they said, we got nothing in common. That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so Swiss has its own thing. You probably know in France, the guy is John Calvin. He's a little bit later, like 100 years after, not 100 years, 50 years after Luther, right? And he's the one who comes up with the idea of predestination. He's also the one that comes up with the idea of the Protestant work ethic, which we all have. If you live in this country, you have it. You may not know. Simply put, the Protestant work ethic goes like this. Protestants eat better, Catholics sleep better. Because what John Calvin said is that God only elects certain people for salvation and others God elects for damnation. That's the doctrine of election per John Calvin. Or put in a different way, number 6 is an affix and number 7 goes to heaven. And so how do you know if you're elect? Well, you don't, but if you're prosperous, it could be a good sign that you are. How do you prosper? You work harder when there's a rising middle class. So this idea of prosperity, not just for its own sake, but for proving our merit or God's favor, turns out pretty deeply rooted in the American psyche, because the Puritans who came over here were Calvinists.
You said that John Calvin came from France. I thought he came from Switzerland.
He did, but yeah, he did, but he's essentially a French speaking. Keep in mind, Switzerland has 3 national identities and a 4th, which is its own thing. But Geneva, we now say, oh, that's in the country of Switzerland. That wasn't a tight border. It was all the Holy Roman Empire. So Calvin's French Swiss, but French. Yeah. Zwingli was German Swiss. Now, I will tell you, like many native German speakers cannot understand Swiss German.
Really?
It's called Schweizerdeutsch, and it's, I mean, it sounds like a Muppet to me. And I mean, it's just because it lilts. It's not just that the words are pronounced differently. It also has like a lilt to it that's, yeah, we just don't hear that in other parts of Germany. So so it's tough. So that's where Swiss has its 4th identity, distinct from the Italian, the German, and the French. What's happening in, as already mentioned, in Scandinavia, Lutheran ideas take hold. Really strong Lutheran, not strong Catholic base in Scandinavia, not strong since Luther. In England, which is the one that matters for us here as the Episcopalians, Henry VIII was a very strong Roman Catholic. He went to seminary. The plan was he was going to be a bishop because he was the younger brother. His older brother Arthur was the crown prince, and he married the most desirable Spanish jewel, well, actually probably the most influential person in Europe, Catherine of Aragon, who was the brother to Philip of Spain, and I can't remember if it was the cousin or uncle of Charles V, the Holy Roman Empire. And she married Arthur. They never consummated the marriage because he was sick when they got married and he died. And Henry VIII then all of a sudden went from being like groomed to be a bishop to now he's the crown prince. And he had this idea that he probably actually really believed that he should marry his brother's widow to have children with her because that's biblical. It's in Leviticus. It's called levirate marriage. And he wrote the Pope, and it had to wait 10 years to get a special dispensation to do this. So the Pope gave him a dispensation to marry his brother's widow because his brother had not consummated the marriage. That was actually really important in the arrangement. He got it. Apparently, he and Catherine were really well suited, actually. Like she was very smart, clever, theological, pious. And Henry initially was all of those things, apparently. But then there was the problem, as you know, which is that she did not have a male heir And she had several stillborn or early terminated pregnancies. And the last one, the kid looked like a monster. Had I don't want to say had green skin, but just imagine had like many physical deformities. And Henry actually started to think he'd done the wrong thing theologically. I mean, yes, he wanted an heir. Yes, he did. But also give him some credit. He thought God was punishing him. He had written a book called In Defense of the Seven Sacraments against Luther's reform. He wrote it. I mean, maybe Thomas More helped him. I don't know. But he wrote that against the Protestant Reformation. Because remember, if you're Lutheran, there's 2 sacraments, not 7. Baptism and the Lord's Supper. So Henry, staunch advocate, again, until he wasn't. And he wrote the Pope for a dispensation for divorce. That happened from time to time. For an annulment, not a divorce, really. And the Pope might have wanted to give him that. It's very possible. The problem was that the Pope was under siege by Philip from Spain. Because remember, the Pope had a political empire with land, the Papal States, and Philip was agitated with him and had invaded the Papal States. So you're under siege by the Queen's brother, and if you give this dispensation, you're now going to make your attacker even more inspired to loot and pillage and destroy what you have. So the Pope can't do it. So what's Henry going to do? Keep in mind, Henry survived the War of the Roses. The Lancasters and the Yorks destroyed each other over a battle of succession. And his father, Henry VII, just kind of slipped in and made the Tudor dynasty. So Henry knows what happens to a country that doesn't have an heir. You could say it's selfish, but as a king, it's also really helpful for your people to have stability and not have another dynastic civil war. So yes, it's self-motivated, and he wants to serve his people. So what does he do? Anne Boleyn, right? Who, what do you know, was a Protestant. And she was Catherine of Aragon's handmaiden, and she became pregnant. And Henry was sure it's going to be a boy. It's so interesting what we're sure of. And so he had to engineer, how do I get this to be a valid child and not a bastard? Catherine had a girl, Mary, later called Bloody Mary, right? But what do we do about Anne? So this is when Henry starts working, and this isn't just a political problem, it's also a theological problem. The Pope won't give me this dispensation, so what am I going to do? What he comes up with is the same thing that the Peace of Westphalia later does. Whoever the prince is decides the religion in their own area. We call that the Act of Supremacy in England, where the head of the church in England is the head of the realm, not the Pope. By the way, Henry wasn't going to change anything religiously, like nothing. He just wanted the divorce that the Pope couldn't give him. So he finds this wily priest, Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, the Roman Archbishop of Canterbury, who will support this idea. Thomas Cranmer secretly got married to a nun too, right? And now he can be married. So this was one of the first changes, is bishops can be married, right? And this is what happens. The Act of Supremacy is the one that comes through. There's several acts that get passed in Parliament that kind of codify this. How is Henry able to push them through? I mean, maybe it's because he was a bully. Actually, people loved him and they thought he was like smart and affable, and maybe they thought he was right. I don't know the answer, but Parliament votes in favor of all of these different acts, and so then we get the English Church. There's not really an English Reformation to speak of until Henry dies, because Henry was a staunch Catholic. He divorced Anne out of his piety, not against it. But Anne brought some Protestants into the court. You probably know Anne had a daughter who recently, her namesake recently died. He had a daughter, Elizabeth, right? But then Anne got killed for flirting with other men. Then Henry married this lady called Jane Seymour, who arguably might have been the one he loved the most. She had a boy, but she died during childbirth. That was Edward. He was born sick and weak from the get-go. And by the way, he lived till he was like 14, I think. And when you're the king and you're like 5, who's really ruling? Your advisors, which thanks to Anne Boleyn and Thomas Cranmer, were Protestants. So the English Reformation really happened from Anne Boleyn and Thomas Cranmer's influence over Edward Jane Seymour's son. He did also marry Catherine Parr, Catherine Howard, and Anne of Cleves. So Anne of Cleves was the next one. He married her based on Hans Holbein's portrait, which he found very becoming. It turned out Henry was actually pretty creepy. I don't want to tell you that story, but he didn't like Anne of Cleves, so he divorced her, and she got a palace in Richmond, and she lived there the rest of her life with like a royal allowance. Then it was Catherine Howard, who he ended up beheading because she was flirting with one of his advisors, probably getting taken advantage of, actually. And then last one was Catherine Parr, who outlived him. Then came Edward, and Edward's Protestant advisors made the Church of England really Protestant. Married clergy, taking down rood screens. That's the screen that blocks you from where the priests are saying the mass, helps you understand, helps you not know that they're illiterate and don't know what they're doing. So remove that rood screen. Statuaries start to come down. Vestments start to get thrown out the window. People wear plain clothes. Before the collar, and this is still true in Germany, clergy don't wear the collar. They wear this kind of like little bow tie thing. Not a bow tie, this little dangly thing. English clergy wore that too, right? But so under the Edwardian reforms, all that kind of goes out the window, and you start to get like a really low church in England. Just fast forwarding what happens in England, right? Edward dies, and the next to the throne is none other than Mary, who becomes Bloody Mary because she goes back and says, nope, we're fully Catholic. So all you Anglican clergy, I'm going to kill you for being traitors. Well, we had royal permission. Yeah, no good. So then now there's this other purge. And ultimately how this happens. Mary dies of natural causes early, and so Elizabeth becomes the queen, and she's the one who says, we're doing this in the middle. So the Church of England becomes between the Protestant church, Protestant in theology, Catholic in formality. The vestments come back. Stained glass windows come back. Altar comes back instead of Lord's table. So that's how England rolls it out. A lot of different rollouts that happen so once Luther does this, and keep in mind, there's also now this growth of nationalism. The Holy Roman Empire is breaking apart because it's got too many different component pieces that it's trying to combine under one language that people don't speak. So now starts to become the rise of nationalism, where France is now France, not the Holy Roman Empire. And Germany is now Germany, not Germania. And then there's the Netherlands and the Low Countries and Belgium, and these places start to have like their own national identity and adopt their own language, which they've been speaking the whole time anyway. But now there's some encouragement that, hey, we can split apart. And so you get more and more denominations. And there's some really radical things that happen. Like there's these people called the Diggers who want to redistribute all the land in England. Like, let's make sure no one has more than anybody else. It's early communism. There's of course the initial the Amish are the ones who indirectly come out of this. They come out of it through the Mennonites. The first Mennonite, Menelaus Simons, wasn't a pacifist. He thought they were supposed to hasten the rule hasten Christ's return on earth by establishing a theocracy in the town of Münster, which they did, and other Germans militarily crushed it. After which point, Mennonites became pacifists, and Amish people came out of that tradition, also pacifist, right? You probably know that. And they speak Pennsylvania Dutch, which is like German sentence structure in English with some German. But these are the roots of this, is how do you have just one Reformation, which is why we call this the Reformations, plural. You've probably heard there's a thing called the Counter Reformation, where the Catholic Church says, well, we need to give a response to these Lutherans that's not just military. We're going to give a theological response. Pretty much they didn't change anything. I mean, just to let you know. But one of the things they did change is they said that the Pope, when the Pope has authority to actually have a conversation with the Bible and even supersede it. And so this is the time at the Council of Trent when the Pope takes the Apocrypha and makes it scripture. So it had been an appendix. And at the Council of Trent, the Pope is showing that he has the authority to decide what scripture is. Does not happen with an ecumenical council, does not. Some of the other reforms they make are like, we don't like having illiterate clergy, so we need to work on that. Like, that's fair, but we're not freeing serfs, we're not freeing peasants, we're not having latitude about divorce or Latin in the Mass. Right. So again, I want you to hear a lot did not change from the Tridentine reform. It's really weird. You'd think it would be called the Trentian reform, but it's Tridentine. Like the word trident, but there's not three changes, just to be clear. It's a weird function of language. And so that's Council of Trent, 1562 to 1568. That's kind of when that's going on. That was really, really fast. Meanwhile, you probably know there's these other people called the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists say, right, that baptism in the Bible is only practiced by adults, which means if you got it as an infant, it didn't count. So you got to be baptized as an adult. And wow, that was really, really unpopular to Roman Catholics and Lutherans alike, because they said you're competing with grace and sacraments. And so many Anabaptists were given what's called a third baptism and had rocks tied around their feet and thrown into water so they were drowned. And these were probably the most persecuted group. They also were pacifists and would not fight back or in battles. Radical tradition, very not communistic, but communal. Shared resources. Clergy weren't above lay people, like we're all in this kind of together, but took very seriously biblical literacy and adult believer baptism. Which you're starting to hear, oh, like, is that where the Baptists come from? Eventually, yes, initially, no. And Anabaptists, as I mentioned to you, are very hated because they don't believe in a hierarchy and because they're challenging sacramental efficacy. And this is all within a century, right? So this is the 1500s where all of this is going on. And part of the consequences here too, right, is people realize how many people died during the 30 Years' War, which is like more people that have died in World War I and World War II put together, which is a little crazy to think about that. And they're Christians killing Christians. So this is when things start to lead into the Enlightenment, by the way, where people start to get a little more secularized because they say, look what all that fervor and religious zeal got us. It got us literally killing our neighbor. And that plays out in all the other countries. So France goes back and forth. Is it Catholic or is it Huguenot? Huguenots, right, are French Presbyterians, because John Calvin was French, right? So like, that's how it comes. And the Huguenots make their way up into Scotland with John Knox. And there's a really problem up in Scotland between Mary, Queen of Scots, who's Catholic, and John Knox, who, well, the people liked him better, to be honest, because Mary wasn't Scottish. John wasn't either, but never mind all that, right? So there's multiple competing influences going around, and they all have to do with who are we as a people? What's our national identity? Who's in charge?
God needed to come down.
Well, and again, people thought God, that's part of why the Kingdom of Munster was a thing. It's like Jesus, like Catholics are killing Protestants. This must be the end of the world. We're like literally killing each other in scores. Yeah. So that's the 1500s there in a nutshell. I know that was really fast. So let me just pause for a second.
Somewhere in there, where'd you leave the Spanish? I forgot what happened.
Oh, nothing happened in Spain. The Inquisition drove everybody out, and Spain became like the most solidly staunch Roman Catholic country in Europe. I mean, it did. There was no infiltration in Spain. Because if you weren't Spanish Roman Catholic, get out or we'll kill you, or something like that. I mean, Spain became, and it's really interesting because Spain, in some ways, was the most wealthy country in Europe, having discovered the New World and enslaved all those people and stole their silver, right? I mean, that's the
Yeah, I was
story
gonna
of,
ask about the New World.
Yeah.
When did they?
1492 was Columbus, but then you start sending out more explorers, and the Pope actually got into this and decided that the New World would be divided between Portuguese and Spain, because those were the two countries sending folks out. Portugal used to be like a global superpower, right? Amerigo Vespucci is a Portuguese guy, right? So the Pope even steps in and splits it by latitude, but Spain has all of this money, like these gold and silver ships coming back, and they have the Armada, which is like, well, I don't really even know what to compare it to. The United States Air Force. Do you know the biggest Air Force in the world is the U.S. Air Force?
Yes.
Do you know the second biggest Air Force in the world? The U.S. Navy. I'm not kidding. So this is the U.S. Air Force, and then there's little old England up here. And they start realizing that they can get into the New World, but even better, they don't have to extract all that silver and gold. They'll just rob the Spanish ships, right? So Francis Drake, who you've probably heard of, the pirate, who arguably explores like the Hudson Bay and all that, does this with the Queen's like favor. You can keep robbing these ships because we're getting a lot of money. And then Philip sends the Armada up there. And this was like one of these global moments in history. Like, how could it happen? No one thought the English could survive that. It was impossible, right? It was like throwing rocks at tanks, except turns out the Armada was made up of these really big ships, like aircraft carriers. And the English Navy was made up of these small little clippers, like, I don't even want to call them battleships, smaller than that, like destroyers. And there was also some really bad weather. And what do you know? The whole Armada got sunk in a day. And there went all Spain's money, all of it. Poof, gone. Because they couldn't protect their merchant marine anymore. They'd invested all that money in sailors and mercenaries and boats, and that was on the bottom of the ocean. By the way, if you ever heard of the Black Irish, this is where the Black Irish come from. Moorish slaves who are running the Armada swim ashore to Ireland, and that's where dark skin comes from in the Irish.
If you ever visit Derry, Londonderry, there's a whole big thing about that in one of the museums. Very interesting.
And all comes from the sinking of the Armada. But that was like a European surprise. That would be like the US losing to Mexico. Like it's like impossible that Spain was going to lose this, but then they did. And now all of a sudden, because you've got a monarch on the throne a long time. I mean, Elizabeth rules like 50 years, right? You've got a lot of stability. You've got all of a sudden no more fleet to challenge you. And this starts to begin the seeds of English colonialism. So that's one of those big developments that gets us into the 1600s as well. What else am I missing from Reformation?
When is the printing press?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that is commensurate with Luther, right? Gutenberg is the one he doesn't invent it. He's the one who adopts it and gets the credit for it. And what do you know? He did it really close to where Luther was, right? Used to be you had to copy everything by hand. And essentially the printing press is Chinese and Arabic technology with a couple European twists. And Gutenberg is the one who we most remember for it. And one of the first books he prints is the Luther Bible in German, because he's in a Lang, an area ruled by a Protestant prince that will not kill him for doing that. And boy, that book sells like hotcakes because it's cheap. It used to be a Bible would cost you a year's wages. I mean, you had to pay somebody a whole year to make one, so that was expensive. But now it's It's on paper, and you can get it out there, and this is really fast. One of the things Henry VIII does that's really interesting is he does insist that every church in England has a Bible, because they didn't. They were too precious, but those Bibles are chained to the church, so you can't steal them, because that's a lot of wealth you can walk away with. So thank you. The printing press comes out, and that doesn't only help the Bible, that also helps these reformers disseminate their ideas quickly and effectively throughout the continent. And there's a lot of ideas coming out, right? Because this is the Renaissance. So now there's like Arabic learning and lost ideas from St. Patrick. And there's these people like Erasmus, who's Dutch, right? Erasmus is the prince of the Renaissance, because he says, look, if the Bible's written originally in Greek and in Hebrew, we should learn those languages and use those to go to our original language, not Latin. And it's so curious that initially Erasmus didn't have any of those manuscripts, so he went from Latin to Greek and from Latin to Hebrew so that he could have it in Greek and Hebrew. Which is like probably even worse than using the Vulgate. But anyway, like you can appreciate what he's trying to do intellectually.
When we went to Spain, when we went on the guidebook, they suggested that when we went from Portugal to Spain, I think that's right. Is that right? Where I asked permission, they said, the guidebook said, you might ask, it might be better if you ask permission to, if you're a Spanish speaker, to speak Spanish. Me da permiso de hablar español.
Yeah.
And I did, and the guy, the guard that talked to me was in shock that I would ask, because he said, las españolas, the Spaniards never ask permission for anything. They think they own all of it.
And I would tell you that goes back to Ferdinand and Isabella. I mean, actually, I would.
They still think they own the whole continent and everything is Spanish.
It's commonly, I mean, this is a common understanding that a Spanish person in Spain cannot understand Portuguese because they won't.
Right.
But a Portuguese person readily understands Spanish because they will.
Yes.
It's very interesting, right?
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I love that part of the world, just because it feels like maybe there's some connection to.
Yeah, of course.
Where does Thomas Cromwell come in?
Thomas Cromwell. Yeah, I haven't got to that part of the story yet. He's 1600s. Just a couple other things to remind you, right? That we often forget this, but there was this Portuguese prince, Henry the Navigator, who's the one who decided that Africa sort of should belong to the Portuguese, and the people there were fit to be enslaved. That was Henry the Navigator in Portugal. And so now we're starting to get the seeds of the slave trade from Africa as well in the 1600s and 1500s. Obviously, the New World isn't quite settled, so we don't have the slave market that we're going to get at the end of the 1600s. But there's this understanding now of what we start to call imperialism. I know in a textbook, you don't get to imperialism until the 1800s, but we're getting the groundwork of this, right? We have the high civilization, and we know better as Catholics than those Protestants. So we're at the top of the cultural food chain, which means everybody underneath us will benefit from our patronage, which usually meant enslavement.
How are they reconciling all this, like divorce and well, taking things from others with their commandments like that?
Well, because
don't covet your.
Well, because they're doing it for God. They're not doing it for themselves.
Not really. Yeah.
And God rewards you with prosperity.
And then God rewards you with prosperity because you were faithful. Even though like you killed someone and took their money is how you got the money. But no, I got it because I was faithful in persecuting evil. So it just depends on which portions of the Bible you privilege over others. And look, one of the worst things we can all do, and I love doing this, is thinking I'm right. I love being right. Don't you love being right? I love it. I love it. And because I'm right, you probably aren't. So it'd be great if I could fix you up. And look, if you're obstinate in being fixed, well, like I'll probably do a favor and kill you because then you won't have to live an ignorant life anymore. Or even better, I'll make you my slave so you can spend more time with me and support my grand ideas. I know that sounds nuts, but that's kind of how it works, isn't it?
Well, also, I think they thought of people from Africa as sort of less inhuman, so it was okay.
Because they didn't see their own standard of living. They didn't look very hard. And I mean, they just didn't. And mostly because they discovered it, they found it. They didn't realize that they were actually the new world. They didn't realize that. They were the ones with the boats. So they had the old world. Mediterranean means the middle of the world. According to who? According to the people who make the maps, right? So all of this starts to become, right? And hey, you start to get a little bit more educated. Remember, like the first year of college, you were probably insufferable because you knew all this stuff now, right? You knew everything because you'd been to college for a semester. I mean, that's kind of what the Enlightenment did to people. I mean, the Renaissance, right? Early Enlightenment. It's like, now look at how much we know and how much you don't know. Yeah.
When Martin Luther translated the Bible into German, did he use the old script?
Yeah, which by the way, if you've seen
Yes.
what Hitler wrote or what the Nazis put out, that's like archaic German script. I mean, I have
Absolutely.
trouble even reading it.
Yeah, me too. I did German for a couple of years and it was, yeah.
Like I lived there for more than a year and I still have a hard time reading that script because it's just hard.
So would the people be able to, could they read it or is it just?
5% of them. I mean, keep in mind, there's not blanket literacy like there is now.
Mhm.
You're still talking about literacy growing, but growing to how big? 20% if you were really lucky. 20% literacy rate. So again, there's book fairs. Those are for middle class and above. I mean, no peasant's going to go to a book fair. How are they going to buy? What leisure time do they have? So all of this is changing. And by the way, remember when the peasants in Germany wanted that, Luther said, "You exist to serve, so I hope you die 1,000 deaths." I mean, like Luther was a church reformer, not a social reformer. He really was not interested in reforming society.
Going back to like translations a bit, I remember one of the talking points I've heard from the Islamic side is the only true Quran is written in Arabic.
It is true.
Yeah.
Well, it's not, they don't use that phrase. The Holy Quran
Okay.
is Arabic, and if it's not Arabic, it's not the Holy Quran.
Could you
It's a
call it just the
translation.
Quran?
What's that?
Could you call it just the Quran if it's not?
You could, but like even that sounds really funny. Like this is all English. If you're Muslim, you must speak Arabic, because if you don't, you're not reading your own scriptures in their original language. I mean, part of how Islam has some traction is they say the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible have errors. They're corrupted. That doesn't mean they're all wrong, but they've got mistakes. That's not wrong. We don't have the original documents. We have translations. And I know people who like only the Bible, but they read it in English. I mean, it's a little disingenuous. So if you really want to if you like the Bible's the most important thing, why don't you learn Greek and Hebrew so you can read the oldest versions we have? It's a little bit of a paradox having grown up fundamentalist.
Arrogance.
It sadly is arrogance and misplaced, right? So like if you say that, fine, then put the work behind it. If you're Muslim, your claim is there are no errors in the Quran. It's not entirely true, it turns out, but the claim is it came from Jibril to Muhammad, peace be upon him, and that's what we're still reading, exactly that. There's some pushy parts in the story, as you'll hear, because Muhammad, peace be upon him, didn't write the Quran. He was illiterate till he died. He recited it, and other people wrote it down. And we have found some early Qurans that have textual variants in them, it turns out. So, but the claim was, look, you've got variants in your scriptures, so you got a problem. I mean, this is where Islam, they do nail that. They have that right.
It kind of seems like it came from the PR department of the Islam to say, we're closer to the translation, so.
Well, there's still the insistence is
Yeah.
there is no real translation.
Uh-huh.
It's Arabic or nothing.
I shouldn't say translation, closer to the original language.
Yeah. Well, and because part of what they get that we don't get, see, when we read Hebrew Bible, like prophets and poetry and Psalms, we read it as text, but they're poems and they're hymns. The reason you have to learn Arabic is because those don't translate well, right?
Mhm.
So it's not just Arabic words you have to know, it's Arabic poetic devices and hymnody for the Quran to make sense, because it is considered the highest form of Arabic ever written. Like, it's considered a work of genius literarily, poetically. And if you translate that, you lose the genius. You lose the inspiration, I guess would be another way to say that. Yeah, we've kind of accepted that's okay. Words are words, so it doesn't matter. But again, like we read the prophets like it's prose, but none of them are prose. It's all poetry. You asked about Thomas Cromwell, and you might be more interested in Oliver Cromwell, but Thomas Cromwell is the hand of the king, which is like the second in command, right? Hand of the king. That's from Game of Thrones. He's not the hand of the king. He's the chancellor, I think.
Yeah.
So he basically acts like Henry. He does most of the ruling and carries Henry's signet ring. And he's the one who pushes through the Act of Supremacy because he's extremely powerful. In some ways, he is the king, but for the name, right? Ultimately, he falls out of favor with Henry because that can happen. Henry was a fickle man, it turns out, especially as he aged. Very jovial and affable and all that, but he falls out of favor and he gets his head cut off. And so does Thomas More, right? Which you can see that movie, A Man of All Seasons. Past all that, though, it turns out like his great-grandson, Oliver Cromwell, is going to take over the English government later and wreak havoc on the Irish. We're not quite there yet. Something else really happens that's important, starting with Elizabeth for us. You've probably heard that there's these people in England who they really thought that the getting rid of the Roman Catholic tradition was the right thing to do. And then when Elizabeth allowed vestments to come back, they thought this was, well, heretical and giving in. Like this was some kind of compromise, and faith was not a thing you should compromise for. And so they complained a lot, and they wanted to purify the church of vestments and art and any money expenditures that weren't serving basic necessities. So really, there's a very low emphasis on things like beauty. Everything is just functional. And it turns out like they were a small group of people and no one really liked them. And they weren't going to be accepted. So they kind of had to decide, are we going to acquiesce on our beliefs? No. Are we going to die? We'd rather not. And killing people was kind of going out of fashion after the 30 Years' War because so many died. So we'll go into exile. And they got in a boat called the Mayflower. And those are the Puritans. Now, to be clear, they had no interest in freedom of religion. They had interest in freedom for their religion. When they got here, they didn't say, oh, my Native American brothers and sisters. They said, you're wrong, we're right. And there is that interesting moment in the first Thanksgiving where the Native Americans are like, you guys are stupid and you're going to die. So we'll teach you how to live. And they're like, thank you. And now we'll subjugate you. Curious part of American history, isn't it? Like the Pilgrim myth. So to be really clear, the Puritans were a splinter Anglican group that could not accept a compromise that Elizabeth offered. It had to be their way only. And they were the first ones here. And then later, right, the Armada sunk. So now England can send ships over. Now Catholics start to come over here. Anglican Catholics, keep in mind, but also Catholics, which is why you get Maryland. as in Mary's land, as in Mary, Bloody Mary. But then you get Virginia for the Virgin Queen, right? For Elizabeth. So you're getting groups from England on the seaboard because they don't like each other. And there could be money to be made. So this is part of our own history here, right?
I saw online, I was looking at Episcopal churches in Martin. And one of them was, they said we're Anglican Catholic.
Or Anglo-Catholic, we can hear, yeah.
Yes. So is that these people? I mean, are they?
Maryland, maybe not even. They might have been Roman Catholic. Oh, well, Maryland is Roman Catholic. Sure, that came under Bloody Mary. Virginia is mixed. See, Anglo-Catholic is a more modern term than it was. It didn't really fit at the time of Elizabeth. Anglo-Catholic usually means you're within the Anglican tradition, but you're more. No, it not necessarily. It mostly means that you are holding on to more of the traditional Catholic prayers and practices. So to give you some examples, if a parish calls themselves Anglo-Catholic, like today, it might mean you'll be saying the Hail Mary in the Eucharist, and you might call it the Mass instead of the Eucharist.
And
Yes.
transubstantiation, would you believe in that?
It's hard because actually, like, the position of the Anglican Church is consubstantiation, which doesn't mean no change. It means they don't literally become the body and blood per se. We actually have adopted the Lutheran doctrine of real presence. So just to lay these out, and this is interesting because Zwingli said it's symbolic remembrance. The Roman Church said it's transubstantiation, which is Aristotelian. It means that it means the essence changes even if the accidents don't. Doesn't taste like blood, doesn't taste like flesh, but if you took a microscope, it would be flesh and blood. I mean, that's transubstantiation. That is what it means. You can say, that's not what I believe. It's fine, but that's what it means. Consubstantiation means throw the microscope out. The bread and the wine are changed, and they're changed with the real presence, and there's some mystery into that. Right, so you actually, if you think about it, the real difference between con and trans is whether there's a biochemical change, but they both assert a real change happened.
I'm confused. Which is the Roman Catholic?
Transubstantiation. This is literally the blood of Jesus.
Yeah.
Literally the flesh. Consubstantiation says not literally, but actually. If that's confusing, it's because it is. Symbolic or an ordinance or a remembrance says it's only meaningful if you remember it correctly. What you put in determines what you put out, what you get out, which means do it really carefully. It's funny. Actually, like Southern Baptists taking communion are more uptight about doing it wrong than Episcopalians are. Because if you do it wrong in the Southern Baptist Church, you can eat and drink judgment on yourself. In the Episcopal Church, by and large, like, look, we've already had confession, so how are you going to get that wrong? And beyond that, sacraments don't hurt you, they give you grace. Zwingli was a symbolic. Luther, consubstantiation. The Church of England was transubstantiation until Edward. I mean, Henry VIII was transubstantiation. He wrote a book about it, but then he died. So Edward changed it to con. John Calvin, consubstantiation.
When we were in Geneva and Oregon, they don't have any statutes or anything else in the church.
They purified all that.
Yeah.
Stained glass windows got broke out too. Queen Elizabeth put them back in. I mean, Edward broke them, Mary put them back, and Elizabeth said, well, I guess we can keep them. Yeah, but you go into these big Lutheran churches still in Germany, they're bare.
Yeah.
Because they said that stuff's idolatrous. And like this happens often with us when we have major change, we throw babies out with bathwater. And so, like I would tell you, if you go to a pretty church in the United States, it's probably Catholic or Episcopal. Because low Protestants don't build pretty churches because they don't believe in beauty for its own sake. I don't mean they hate beauty. I don't mean that. They don't want to fund it. So nothing against Nassau Bay Baptist. It's an ugly building, and it doesn't have any windows, not any real windows. That's so that they can have lights in there, like a theater experience. And I'm not saying it's wrong. I just mean that tends to be like the low Protestant aesthetic is different from the middle and high aesthetic, right? Like, who writes about beauty? James Joyce. Was he Catholic? I mean, he was until he wasn't, right? But he's the one who came up with like doctrines of aesthetics. St. Thomas is the one who wrote all those books, and he also had a high view of aesthetics, like beauty is from God, beauty is to be celebrated, even for its own sake. So there tends to be like different architecture between Episcopal churches and Southern Baptist churches. Why did Southern Baptist churches like really big steeples? Because Puritans weren't allowed to have steeples in England because they weren't Anglican. So when they got here, they built the biggest ones they could, right? Because look, now we can do it. I mean, I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, but I'm not kidding. We don't have steeples, we have bell towers.
When you build a Catholic church, you have to have it facing a certain way. Is that the same way with the Episcopal church?
No. You also have to have it until Vatican II. You also had to have a holy relic, or you couldn't have it. The relic is what made the church sanctified, and you don't have to do that now. Although many Catholic churches do have relics, right? We don't have reliquaries in the Anglican tradition. We did do away with that. Elizabeth got away with that as a way of making sacred space. So you don't have to have a relic. And there's a few things even Anglo-Catholic churches don't use, like a monstrance. Does anybody know what this is?
Yes.
It contains
Where the host is.
the host, and it kind of looks like sun rays coming out.
Yeah.
But you kind of parade it around, right? Like on festival days, you parade the monstrance. The real reserve you're going to take is living in the tabernacle. I mean, you're not going to come out and pull that out of the monstrance. Like, you can't even touch that as a layperson, right? That's the domain of the priest. And there's some other things, not putting our Roman brothers and sisters down, because there's still some Anglo-Catholics do this too. They won't take the host with their hands because the idea is that your hands are too dirty to touch the body of Jesus. So the priest puts it directly in your mouth.
Back in the old days, and a Catholic, that's the way it used to be for me.
Yeah, and since Vatican II, this has also changed. Pre-Vatican II, really unlikely you were getting any wine as a layperson. The wine was for the clergy. You just got the host.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's still some Catholic churches where you won't be getting wine. That's just for the clergy and maybe the altar. They're still just boys, aren't they? I don't think there's altar girls. I think they're altar boys.
No,
There are some?
They're
Okay.
altar girls. Yeah.
Okay, lovely to hear. Obviously, we have altar girls now too ourselves. Took us a while as well, right? We weren't that much ahead. Okay, so look, I got us to the 1600s. Anything else that you're curious about this week?
Well, I think I might have missed it. Illuminated manuscripts, when were that?
Oh, we did talk about this last week. That was the one, and even maybe 2 weeks ago. That was the Irish contribution. Remember, the Irish saved civilization because the barbarians were destroying things, and the Irish just started copying everything, even if they didn't understand it. And in so doing, they're the ones who separated Greek words because they were all written together. And they're the ones who also, with this aesthetic of beauty, keep in mind, very few people could read still. So the Illuminator really was a theology of beatifying this text. So you believed it had inspiration. So why would you make it plain? So now we're talking about like the Book of Kells.
Yeah. So those were in Greek or Latin? Greek.
Well, they were in both according to
okay.
what they could get.
Okay.
And this is more of an Irish thing, right? Because keep in mind, Ireland is like on the fringe of the world. Like if it was understood, if you walked off the coast of Spain too far, you'd fall off the world. Ireland is like similar. This is, and has always had this really bad reputation.
Back up again.
Yeah. I remember the Romans didn't know what to do with the Irish, they just built a wall. Right? Hadrian's Wall was because these people are too savage to even conquer, so we're just gonna try to exile them. So kind of Ireland got a little free reign for a while. Well, until the English decided that they were subhuman and should be their slaves, right? And so that, yeah.
Port Island.
Mhm.
Really tough. And there's an interesting book. I haven't read it, but the title says it all, How the Irish Became White, which talks about how in this country, Irish people were treated as fourth-class citizens, well, like until this century.
Yeah, my grandmother was, I say half and half, her father was Scottish, her mother was Irish. And she never claimed her Irish heritage.
So it's interesting because the word Scottish means Scot-Irish. Either you're a Scot, you're Irish, or you're Scottish, which is Scotch-Irish.
But yeah, her surname was, but her mother was from Ireland. And she never claimed that because of the way the Irish read it.
Yeah, I mean, the Scots didn't get much better treatment for a long time.
But it was better than the Irish.
Yeah,
you know?
we can talk about the
So,
Scots later if you want, because they show up in the Stuarts who replace Elizabeth. Yeah. Okay, I think we're at a good stopping point. Next week, we'll talk about the King James Bible, and I'll move a little faster because I don't want to bore you to tears or anything.
Not
You
me
have
at all.
great years. That's awesome. I just can't keep up with all.